Every night, the sun god dies, and what kills him is more terrifying than you imagine. Good evening, and welcome to another journey into the shadows of ancient Egypt. Tonight, we descend into the daily nightmare of Ra, the most powerful deity in the Egyptian pantheon, a god who ruled the heavens by day, only to face death itself when darkness fell. You see, Ra wasn't just a sun god basking in eternal glory. He was trapped in an endless cycle of death and rebirth, hunted nightly by a serpent so vast it could swallow reality itself. But that's only where our story begins. Settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to discover why the ancient Egyptians viewed every sunrise not as a certainty, but as a miracle earned through cosmic warfare. The tale of Ra begins not in the familiar golden temples of pharaonic Egypt, but in the primordial darkness that existed before time itself had meaning. In those first moments of creation, when the universe was nothing more than the endless waters of none, a vast ocean of potential that stretched infinitely in all directions, there was no light, no sound, no movement, only the heavy, pregnant silence of possibility waiting to be born. From these primordial waters, through an act of will so profound that it created the very concept of intention, Ra brought himself into existence. This wasn't birth in any sense that mortals could understand, but rather a fundamental reorganization of reality itself. Where there had been only void, suddenly there was consciousness. Where there had been only darkness, suddenly there blazed the first light the universe had ever known. Ra's emergence from none was accompanied by the creation of the first solid ground, the Benben stone, a primordial mound that served as the foundation for all future creation. Upon this stone, Ra stood alone in the infinite darkness, his divine light casting the first shadows, creating the first concepts of here and there, before and after. The very act of his existence established the fundamental dualities that would define all future reality. But creation through will alone was exhausting work, even for a god. Ra understood that if the universe was to be more than just himself standing on a rock in infinite darkness, he would need to create other beings to share the burden of existence. And so, through methods that the ancient texts describe with reverent euphemism, Ra began the process of divine reproduction. With his own saliva and tears, substances that carried his divine essence but were separate from his core being, Ra birthed the first gods: Shu, the air that fills lungs and carries prayers, and Tefnut, moisture itself that blessed the land with life-giving rain. These weren't simply offspring in the biological sense, but aspects of Ra's own divine nature given independent existence, each carrying a portion of his creative power, while remaining forever connected to their source. From Ra's divine laughter came the winds that would eventually push ships along the Nile, carry the scents of flowers across gardens, and whisper secrets between lovers in the night. From his sighs emerged the gentle breezes that would cool workers laboring under the desert sun, rustled the papyrus reeds along river banks, and carried the smoke of incense offerings to the very heavens themselves. Every breath taken by every living creature that would ever exist was in essence borrowed from Ra's infinite lungs. Every tear shed in joy or sorrow carried an echo of the moisture that had first brought Tefnut into being. The wind that filled a merchant's sails, the breeze that dried a mother's laundry, the hurricane that scattered enemy fleets, all were manifestations of Ra's continuing creative act. But power, even divine power, comes with a price that echoes through eternity. The same creative force that brought forth life also attracted the attention of chaos itself, ancient, patient, and hungry for the destruction of everything Ra had built. For in the act of creating order from void, Ra had also created its opposite, the concept of entropy, of dissolution, of return to the primordial darkness from which he had emerged. This wasn't an unintended consequence but a necessary one. Creation requires boundaries, and boundaries require something to push against. Order is meaningless without the possibility of chaos. Light has no significance unless darkness exists to define it. In bringing forth existence, Ra had simultaneously created the forces that would eternally seek to destroy it. As Shu and Tefnut grew in power and independence, They began their own creative work, bringing forth Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. Geb lay beneath, his body forming mountains and valleys, his breath creating earthquakes, his dreams becoming the minerals and gems that would be discovered by future miners. Nut arched above, her star-spangled body forming the vault of heaven, her tears becoming rain, her laughter becoming thunder. But the relationship between earth and sky became problematic. Geb and Nut were not content to remain in their assigned positions. They desired to embrace, to unite their powers in ways that threatened to collapse the carefully established order of creation. Their passionate attempts to merge would have resulted in the destruction of the space between heaven and earth, the realm where life was meant to flourish. Ra commanded Shu to separate his children permanently, to stand between earth and sky, and hold them apart with his eternal strength. This separation was both necessary and tragic. Necessary because life required the space between opposites to flourish. Tragic because it condemned Geb and Nut to eternal longing, able to touch only at the horizon where their realms briefly met at dawn and dusk. From this enforced separation, from the tension between earth's reaching upward and skies pressing downward, came the next generation of gods: Osiris, the king of the underworld; Isis, the goddess of magic and wisdom; Set, the lord of chaos and storms; and Nephthys, the guardian of the dead. Each of these deities carried within themselves the unresolved tension between their parents, the eternal struggle between stability and change, order and innovation. Ra appeared in many forms throughout the day, each transformation marking not just the passage of time, but preparation for the cosmic battle that awaited him when darkness fell. These weren't simply different names for the same deity, but distinct aspects of Ra's divine nature, each with its own personality, its own strengths, and its own vulnerabilities. At dawn he was Khepri, the scarab beetle rolling the sun across the sky like dung across desert sand, a humble metaphor that contained profound wisdom about the nature of divine work. The scarab beetle, one of nature's most dedicated workers, spends its entire life rolling balls of dung that are vastly larger than itself, creating from waste the nutrients necessary for new life. The Egyptians saw in this behavior a perfect symbol for Ra's daily labor, taking the darkness of night, the spiritual waste of fear and despair, and transforming it through persistent effort into the light that enables all life to flourish. Khepri's form reminded worshippers that even the most glorious achievements required the grinding, persistent work of creatures close to the earth. The sun's daily journey wasn't effortless divine privilege, but labor that required the same dedication shown by the humblest insects. This aspect of Ra taught that dignity came not from avoiding humble work, but from approaching all tasks, no matter how mundane, with the same commitment that the scarab showed in its endless rolling. The transformation from Khepri to Ra proper occurred at the moment when the sun cleared the horizon and began its climb into the morning sky. This wasn't a gradual change, but a sudden burst of power that sent light racing across the land at speeds that mortal minds couldn't comprehend, banishing shadows, warming the earth, and awakening every living creature to the possibilities of a new day. At noon, when shadows shrank to nothing, and the desert sands became too hot to touch, Ra blazed as himself, the falcon-headed god, whose eye was the sun, whose gaze could wither armies or bless harvests with equal ease. This was Ra at the height of his daily power, when his divine energy reached its peak intensity, and his ability to affect the mortal world was at its strongest. His crown bore the uraeus, the cobra of protection, its hood flared and ready to spit divine fire at any who threatened the cosmic order. This wasn't merely decorative symbolism. The uraeus was a living aspect of Ra's power, capable of independent action when its divine master was focused on other tasks. Ancient texts describe the cobra leaving Ra's crown to personally destroy his enemies, returning only when the threat had been completely eliminated. In this noon form, Ra's voice could command the flooding of the Nile with perfect timing, ensuring that the annual inundation brought fertile silt rather than destructive torrents. His gaze could direct the movement of stars, keeping the celestial clock running with precision, that allowed priests to predict eclipses, plan festivals, and maintain the complex calendar that governed Egyptian civilization. Most importantly, this was when Ra's influence over the fate of pharaohs was strongest. The divine right of kings wasn't just political theory in ancient Egypt, it was understood as a literal connection between the ruling monarch and the sun god himself. At noon, when Ra's power peaked, pharaohs would receive their most important divine guidance, learning through dreams and omens how to govern their people in accordance with cosmic law. But even at his moment of greatest strength, Ra was already preparing for the transformation that would mark the beginning of his daily decline. As the afternoon progressed and shadows began to lengthen, the falcon-headed god would gradually shift into his evening aspect, gathering his energy for the ordeal that awaited him in the underworld. By evening, as the sun touched the western horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took the breath away from mortals lucky enough to witness them, Ra became Adam, the setting sun, preparing for his nightly journey through the underworld. This transformation was the most visually spectacular of the daily cycle, as Ra's brilliant noon radiance softened into the warm golden light that photographers and artists have celebrated throughout history. Adam represented not just the end of the day, but the wisdom that comes with the completion of any great work. Where Khepri embodied the energy of new beginnings, and Noon Ra displayed the power of peak achievement, Adam carried the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing one has done everything possible to achieve success. This transformation was accompanied by rituals in every temple throughout Egypt, priests chanting protection spells and burning incense to strengthen their god for the ordeal ahead. These weren't casual ceremonies, but precisely choreographed events that required years of training to perform correctly. Each word had to be pronounced with exact precision, each gesture completed at precisely the right moment, each offering made with the proper intention. The evening rituals served multiple purposes. They honored Ra's daily sacrifice, provided him with additional strength for his journey through the underworld, and demonstrated humanity's understanding that divine power required mortal support to remain effective. The relationship between gods and mortals in Egyptian theology wasn't one-sided dependence, but mutual cooperation, with each group providing what the other needed for the continuation of cosmic order. Yet what the common people never understood was that this daily transformation wasn't a celebration of divine power, but preparation for war against an enemy older than creation itself. While ordinary Egyptians saw the sunset as a beautiful end to another blessed day, the priests knew that Ra's real work was just beginning. Each morning, Ra would board his sacred barque, the Manjet, a vessel that existed simultaneously in the physical world, visible to mortals, and in spiritual dimensions that could only be perceived by gods and the most advanced magical practitioners. The ship was constructed not from wood or metal, but from crystallized light itself, divine energy given solid form through techniques that had been taught to the earliest priests by Ra himself. The Manjet measured exactly 770 cubits in length, a sacred number that represented the distance between earth and heaven, when measured not in physical spans but in degrees of divine understanding. To mortal eyes, the barque appeared as a beautiful golden ship sailing across the sky, but its true form was far more complex and wonderful than human vision could process. Its hull gleamed like polished gold, but was harder than the finest bronze, capable of withstanding not just the physical stresses of celestial travel, but the crushing spiritual pressures of traveling through dimensions where normal matter would instantly cease to exist. The wood, if it could be called wood, had been grown in divine gardens tended by gods who understood the secret arts of cultivating trees from pure light. Every plank had been shaped by craftsmen whose skills had been perfected over thousands of years of practice. Every joint had been sealed with substances that existed nowhere in the mortal world. Every rope and sail had been woven from threads spun from the very fabric of reality itself. The result was a vessel that could carry its divine crew safely through realms where the laws of physics as understood by mortals had no meaning. Ra was accompanied by a crew of gods who would defend him through his celestial journey, each deity taking positions they had held for thousands of years in a cosmic routine that had become as natural as breathing. These weren't volunteers who served out of friendship or duty, but carefully chosen specialists whose particular skills made them uniquely qualified for the dangers they would face. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, served as navigator, his vast knowledge encompassing not just every current, wind, and cosmic pathway in normal space, but the hidden routes through spiritual dimensions where shortcuts could be taken or traps avoided. His role required not just knowledge, but the ability to make split-second decisions when faced with threats that had never been encountered before. Thoth carried with him scrolls containing maps of regions that existed only during certain phases of the moon, charts showing safe passages through areas where space and time folded in on themselves, and detailed notes about the habits and weaknesses of every demon, monster, and hostile spirit they might encounter. His preparation was so thorough that other gods sometimes joked that Thoth knew more about the underworld than its actual rulers. Set, despite his reputation for chaos and his infamous murder of his brother Osiris, stood as Ra's fiercest defender at the prow of the barque. His position there wasn't honorary or ceremonial. Set possessed a divine fury that made him uniquely suited to battle the forces of primordial chaos that would assault them during their journey through the underworld. His red eyes, which glowed with an inner fire that never dimmed, constantly scanned the horizons for threats that other gods might miss. His massive spear, forged from metals that existed only in the heart of dying stars, was always at the ready. His godly strength, supplemented by an intimate understanding of violence that even other deities found disturbing, made him capable of destroying enemies that could overwhelm entire armies. But Set's value as Ra's defender went beyond mere fighting ability. His chaotic nature made him unpredictable in ways that served as a perfect counter to the rigid, systematic approaches favored by the forces of primordial entropy. Where order-based defenses might be anticipated and countered, Set's creative violence constantly surprised enemies who expected divine behavior to follow established patterns. The goddess Mot, with her ostrich feather of truth and her serene expression that never changed regardless of the horrors they witnessed, maintained cosmic order throughout the journey. Her role was perhaps the most crucial and certainly the most demanding, requiring absolute concentration every moment of their trip through realms where the fundamental laws of reality were constantly under assault. Without Mot's presence, the barque might arrive at its destination early, disrupting harvests and throwing human civilization into chaos. It might arrive late, causing crop failures and famine. It might arrive in the wrong location entirely, leaving entire regions without sunlight, while other areas burned under multiple suns. Her quiet concentration was the invisible foundation upon which all other achievements depended. Mot's feather wasn't just a symbol, but a divine instrument of incredible power. It could detect the smallest deviation from truth or justice, could reveal hidden enemies masquerading as allies, and could restore cosmic balance when hostile forces attempted to corrupt the natural order. In her hands, it became both shield and weapon, protecting the crew from spiritual attacks while maintaining the harmony necessary for their mission to succeed. But the most shocking truth about Ra was yet to come. Other deities took positions as rowers, guards, and warriors, each contributing specialized skills to the collective effort of ensuring Ra's safe passage. Horus, the falcon god whose keen eyesight surpassed even that of his divine father, scouted ahead in his divine form, his eyes capable of spotting threats from distances measured in dimensions rather than miles. Horus could see not just what was present in any given location, but what had been there in the past and what might manifest there in the future. This temporal vision allowed him to warn the crew about delayed action traps, enemies who moved by jumping between moments rather than traveling through space, and dangers that would only become apparent after it was too late to avoid them. Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, whose craftsmanship had helped build the first temples and whose understanding of divine architecture was unmatched, maintained the barque itself throughout their journey. His role required constant attention to details that other gods might consider beneath their notice, but which were essential to their survival. Divine vessels, especially those traveling through hostile dimensions, required maintenance that went far beyond anything needed by mortal ships. Ta had to monitor not just the physical integrity of the hull and rigging, but the spiritual coherence that held crystallized light in solid form, the dimensional stability that kept them anchored to their proper reality level, and the magical protections that prevented hostile forces from simply unmakes them from existence. Sobek, the crocodile god, whose powerful jaws could crush diamonds, and whose hunting instincts had been honed by millions of years of predatory evolution, patrolled the waters beneath and around the vessel. His massive form could move through liquid that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing him to attack enemies that thought themselves safely hidden in parallel realities. Sobek's role was particularly important during the portions of their journey when they had to travel through rivers of liquid fire, oceans of crystallized time, and lakes composed of liquefied fear. In each case, the hostile environment would be filled with predators adapted to those specific conditions, and only Sobek's superior hunting skills could ensure that the crew reached their destination without being devoured by creatures that existed nowhere else in creation. The solar barque wasn't just a vessel of light, it was a warship, armored with scales from the hide of the primordial serpent Nehebkal, and weaponized with spears forged in the fires of creation itself. Every surface bore hieroglyphs of protection that had been carved by the finest divine craftsmen, using tools made from crystallized prayers. Every curve and angle had been designed by divine architects whose understanding of cosmic engineering surpassed anything achieved by mortal minds. The protective hieroglyphs weren't merely decorative but functional magical devices that could deflect attacks from beings whose very existence violated the natural order. Some hieroglyphs created barriers of solid light that could turn aside the claws of chaos demons. Others generated fields of harmonized reality that prevented shapeshifters from assuming forms that could damage the ship. Still others produced emanations of pure order that caused entropy-based creatures to simply dissolve when they came too close. The weapons systems integrated into the barque's design included not just conventional armaments like spears and arrows, but exotic devices that could fire concentrated beams of creation force, launch projectiles that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and generate fields of weaponized law that could bind enemies in chains of their own violated principles. For when Ra's boat touched the western horizon each evening, it would sink into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, where the true horror began. This wasn't simply a matter of changing locations from sky to earth, but a fundamental transition between different modes of existence, from the realm of life and light, into a place where death itself took physical form and stalked the corridors of eternity with the patience of ages. The transition point between the upper world and the Duat was marked by a massive gateway that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. From the perspective of mortals watching the sunset, Ra's barque simply disappeared as the sun sank below the horizon. But from the divine perspective, the crew was actually passing through a portal that led into realms where the rules governing normal reality had no power. The gateway itself was guarded by beings whose names were so potent that speaking them aloud would summon them to the speaker's location immediately. These guardians had been placed there during the earliest days of creation, when the boundaries between different levels of reality were first established. Their duty was to ensure that only properly authorized divine beings could enter the underworld, and that nothing from the Duat could escape into the upper world without permission. The Duat wasn't simply a realm of the dead, as mortal understanding might suggest. It was a twisted labyrinth of rivers of fire, lakes of boiling water, caverns filled with demons who existed solely to prevent Ra's return, and regions where abstract concepts like hope and despair had been given physical form and set to war against each other, for the entertainment of entities too alien for human comprehension. Each of the 12 hours of night brought new terrors that would have driven mortal minds to instant madness. The underworld had been designed by intelligences that existed before the concepts of mercy or compassion had been invented, crafted as a testing ground where even gods would be pushed to the absolute limits of their endurance and beyond. In the first hour of night, Ra's barque would encounter the Watchers of the Portal, massive beings with the heads of jackals and the bodies of men, whose task was to verify that Ra was truly dying and not attempting to cheat death by remaining at full strength. These creatures possessed instruments forged from crystallized despair and devices carved from the bones of extinct concepts, using them to measure the dimming of Ra's light and record the precise degrees of mortality that crept through his divine form. The examination was both humiliating and necessary. Ra had to submit to being prodded, measured, and evaluated by beings whose existence depended on the continuation of the death-rebirth cycle. If he were found to be cheating, maintaining too much of his daytime power during the night journey, he would be forbidden from proceeding, trapped forever in the first hour of the duat, while the upper world remained locked in eternal sunset. But the examination served another purpose as well. The Watchers were also checking for signs of permanent damage, evidence that Ra's ability to be reborn was being compromised by the cumulative effects of his nightly ordeals. If such damage were detected, they would initiate protocols designed to find and train a replacement sun god before the current one finally failed beyond repair. The second hour brought them to the fields of reeds, where the blessed dead dwelt in what appeared to be eternal happiness. To mortal souls who had successfully navigated the judgment process and been found worthy of paradise, this region provided everything they could desire: abundant food, pleasant company, meaningful work, and the constant presence of beloved family members who had preceded them into the afterlife. But even in paradise, danger lurked for the divine crew of Ra's barque. The spirits of the righteous dead, in their joy at seeing their God and their eagerness to express their gratitude for the gift of existence, would cluster around the vessel in numbers so vast that they threatened to sink it through sheer weight of good intentions. More dangerous still were the shape-shifting demons who had learned to disguise themselves as departed loved ones. These creatures would wear the faces of the blessed dead's most cherished family members, whispering lies designed to lead the barque astray or convince crew members to abandon their posts in favor of impossible reunions with people who had died centuries earlier. The demons' deceptions were so perfect that even gods could be fooled, at least temporarily. Only Mate's feather of truth could reliably detect the false spirits, but using it required constant vigilance and careful observation of every soul they encountered. A single moment of inattention could result in the barque being diverted into a trap from which even divine power might not be sufficient to escape. During the third hour, they passed through regions where the damned were burned alive eternally, their screams creating a discordant music that could shatter the minds of lesser gods. This wasn't the metaphorical fire of guilt or regret, but actual flames that burned at temperatures exceeding the core of stars, yet never consumed their victims completely. The heat here was so intense that even Ra's divine fire grew dim, and the crew had to shield their eyes from flames that burned hotter than anything that existed in the normal universe. The air itself had been converted into a plasma of pure agony, and breathing it, even for beings who didn't technically require breath, caused pain beyond any mortal experience. The damned souls burning in these flames weren't necessarily evil in any simple sense. Many were good people who had committed acts that violated cosmic law out of ignorance, desperation, or misguided love. Others were victims of circumstances beyond their control, punished not for their choices, but for the choices made by others. The justice of the duat was absolute and impersonal, caring nothing for intention or context, only for the cosmic consequences of actions taken. And at this moment, the fate of all existence hung by a thread. The fourth hour took them through deserts where lost souls wandered screaming, driven mad by thirst that no water could quench and hunger that no food could satisfy. These weren't merely the spirits of the wicked being punished for their earthly crimes, but included many good people who had become lost during their journey to the afterlife, condemned to eternal wandering because they had never learned the proper prayers or hadn't been buried with the correct magical protections. The desert itself was composed not of ordinary sand but of pulverized bones from every creature that had ever died, mixed with the crystallized tears of everyone who had ever mourned. Walking on this surface produced a sound like breaking glass that drove listeners to despair, while the wind carried voices speaking in languages that had been forgotten before human civilization began. The lost souls moved in vast herds, driven by instincts they no longer understood toward destinations that no longer existed. Some had been wandering for thousands of years, their memories of earthly life faded to fragments, their personalities eroded by endless suffering, until they were little more than concentrated need given human form. Rez's crew had to navigate carefully through these herds, avoiding contact that might result in desperate souls attempting to board the barque in hopes of escaping their fate. While the gods felt compassion for these suffering spirits, taking them aboard would overload the vessel's carefully balanced systems and doom everyone to joining the eternal wandering. In the 5th hour they reached the lake of fire, a body of liquid flame that stretched to the horizon in all directions, its surface disturbed by waves of molten light that rose and fell in patterns that hypnotized observers and drew them to their destruction. The lake had been formed from the tears of rage shed by every creature that had ever died in anger, concentrated and refined until they became a sea of liquid hatred. The barque had to be guided by Thoth's precise calculations to follow a narrow channel through the center of the lake, a path that shifted constantly as the liquid fire moved in currents that followed laws of physics unknown to mortals. 1 degree off course would send them into regions where the temperature exceeded anything that could exist in normal reality. Demons lurking beneath the fiery surface would occasionally breach like whales, their bodies composed of living flame, attempting to grab the oars or the sides of the vessel with appendages that could melt divine metal. These creatures had been born from the lake itself, spontaneous manifestations of pure destructive force that existed only to prevent anyone from crossing safely. The crew had to maintain constant vigilance, striking at the demons with weapons designed specifically for fighting enemies made of fire. But each attack that missed its target would send droplets of molten demon flying in all directions, creating new hazards that could ignite the barque's sails or blind crew members with splashes of liquid flame. The 6th hour brought them to the cavern of Sokar, where the falcon-headed god of the Memphis necropolis dwelt in eternal darkness so complete that even divine senses could barely penetrate it. This wasn't simply the absence of light, but a positive force of unillumination that actively consumed any attempt to create visibility. Here, Rez's light would dim to almost nothing, reduced to a barely perceptible glow that provided just enough illumination to avoid crashing into the cavern walls. The crew would have to navigate by touch and divine instinct through tunnels so narrow that the barque's wings would scrape against walls carved with curses in languages that predated human speech. The curses weren't merely threatening words but active magical effects that would attempt to drain life force, corrupt divine nature, or implant compulsions to abandon the mission and join Sokar in his eternal vigil over the dead. Resisting these effects required constant mental discipline and the ability to maintain focus despite being surrounded by malevolent magic designed by entities whose hatred had been refined over geological ages. Sokar himself was both ally and threat. As a legitimate god of the Egyptian pantheon, he was theoretically on Rez's side in the cosmic struggle against chaos, but his long isolation in the darkness had changed him in ways that even other gods found disturbing. His offers of help always came with prices that were almost as dangerous as the problems they were meant to solve. You haven't heard the most terrifying part yet. The 7th hour was known as the Hall of Judgment, where Osiris sat on his throne of obsidian, weighing the hearts of the newly dead against the feather of Mot. But this wasn't the peaceful, orderly scene depicted in tomb paintings created to comfort the living. This was a cosmic courtroom, where the screams of the condemned echoed from crystalline walls, where the innocent wept tears that became pearls of light, and where the very air tasted of the metallic tang of divine justice dispensed without mercy. The hall stretched for miles in every direction, filled with countless scales where hearts were being weighed simultaneously. Each scale was operated by a different aspect of Osiris, allowing him to judge thousands of souls at once while maintaining perfect attention to the individual circumstances of each case. The condemned weren't simply those who had committed obvious crimes. Many were people whose hearts had been made heavy by accumulated small compromises, gradual abandonments of principle, or simple failures to live up to their own moral standards. The scales detected not just evil actions but every moment of moral cowardice, every abandoned responsibility, every choice of comfort over duty. But perhaps most disturbing were the cases of souls whose hearts were too light, people who had never faced real moral challenges, who had lived lives so sheltered that they had never developed the spiritual weight that comes from making difficult ethical choices. These souls weren't condemned to punishment, but they were found unfit for the higher levels of paradise, relegated instead to regions where they could spend eternity, learning the moral complexity they had avoided in life. During the 8th hour, they encountered the serpents of the deep, lesser cousins of Apophis who attacked in coordinated swarms. These creatures were each the size of war galleys, their scales harder than bronze, their venom capable of corroding divine flesh, and their coils strong enough to crush the bones of gods. Unlike their greater cousin Apophis, who fought alone in his cosmic battle against order, these lesser serpents had learned to cooperate, using pack tactics that made them far more dangerous than their individual power levels might suggest. They would coordinate their attacks, with some serpents serving as distractions while others moved into position for killing strikes. Set would be forced to abandon his usual post at the prow to help fight them off, wielding his spear with skill born of countless similar battles while shouting orders to crew members who had to maintain the barque's course despite being surrounded by enemies. The battle would rage for what seemed like hours, with serpents being destroyed only to be replaced by fresh attackers emerging from the depths. But the real danger wasn't the serpents themselves, it was the possibility that their attack was a diversion meant to draw attention away from some other threat. The crew had to remain alert for secondary attacks while fighting for their lives against enemies that could kill them, if they were careless even for a moment. The 9th hour took them through the desert of knives, where the sand itself was composed of crystallized screams of torture victims, and where the wind carried fragments sharp enough to cut divine skin. This wasn't metaphorical description, but literal fact. Each grain of sand was a scream given physical form, concentrated and hardened until it became a microscopic blade capable of cutting through anything softer than diamond. The wind in this region moved in patterns that defied natural law, creating storms of weaponized agony that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. The crew would have to huddle beneath magical shields while the barque pushed through tempests of sharpened suffering, each gust carrying millions of tiny blades that sought exposed skin with the persistence of living creatures. The shields themselves were marvels of divine engineering, woven from threads of crystallized willpower, and reinforced with fragments of unbreakable determination, harvested from heroes who had died rather than surrender their principles. But even these protections had limits. Prolonged exposure to the knife wind would eventually wear through any defense, no matter how powerful. The desert stretched for what seemed like thousands of miles, though distance had little meaning in a realm where space could be folded, stretched, or inverted according to the whims of entities that existed outside normal reality. Navigation required not just knowledge of direction, but understanding of how to move through regions where the concept of forward might suddenly become backward or inside out. In the 10th hour, they reached the gates of dawn, massive portals constructed from materials that existed only in the moments between sleeping and waking, when the boundary between dreams and reality became permeable enough for impossible substances to take temporary physical form. The gates were guarded by beings whose names were forbidden knowledge. Speaking them aloud would summon the entities immediately, regardless of the speaker's location, or the barriers that might theoretically provide protection. These gates would only open if Ra could answer riddles posed by sentinels who had been mad since before the creation of the world, their questions testing not knowledge or wisdom, but the willingness to embrace paradox and contradiction as fundamental aspects of existence. The riddles had no correct answers in any conventional sense. They were designed to force the respondent to abandon linear thinking and accept that truth could be simultaneously multiple and contradictory. One typical riddle might ask, what is the color of the sound made by silence when it speaks to the darkness about the brightness of shadows? The answer wasn't a word or a phrase, but a state of mind that acknowledged the question's essential meaninglessness while simultaneously recognizing the profound truth embedded within its absurdity. Failure to answer correctly wouldn't result in simple denial of passage. Instead, the failed riddler would be transformed into one of the gate guardians themselves, condemned to spend eternity asking the same impossible questions of future travelers while their own identity slowly dissolved into the collective madness that powered the Sentinel network. Wait, don't miss this detail. Who was waiting in the depths of Duat? The 11th hour brought them to the Chamber of Flame, where Ra would be partially reborn, his light beginning to return as he prepared for the final confrontation that would determine whether the sun would rise again. This chamber existed at the intersection of multiple realities, drawing power from dimensions where different versions of the same cosmic cycle played out with infinite variations. But this renewal came at a terrible cost. Each time Ra regained his power in this chamber, he had to sacrifice a fragment of his original divine essence, trading pieces of his fundamental identity for the strength needed to face Apophis. Over the millennia, these accumulated losses had gradually transformed him from the pure creative force he had once been into something more complex and troubled. The chamber itself was filled with flames that burned at every possible temperature simultaneously, some cold enough to freeze divine flesh solid, others hot enough to melt the fundamental forces that held reality together. Ra had to navigate through this maze of contradictory fire, allowing certain flames to burn away his accumulated weakness while avoiding those that would consume essential aspects of his divine nature. The process was visible to the crew as a terrifying dance between their commander and forces that could destroy him completely if he made a single wrong step. They could only watch helplessly as Ra moved through flames that would have annihilated any other being instantly, trusting his cosmic intuition to guide him safely through a gauntlet that grew more dangerous each time he passed through it. But it was during the 12th and final hour that Ra faced his greatest nemesis, and the battle that would determine not just whether the sun would rise again, but whether reality itself would continue to exist or collapse back into the primordial void from which it had emerged. In the deepest part of the underworld, in a cavern so vast that its walls had never been seen by any light, and whose dimensions operated according to geometries that would drive mortal mathematicians to madness, lived Apophis, known also as Apep, a serpent so massive that its coils could wrap around the entire world 3 times and still have length enough to reach the moon and strangle it. This wasn't merely a large snake, despite the limitations of language that forced ancient scribes to describe it in terms that human minds could barely comprehend. Apophis was the embodiment of primordial chaos, older than creation itself, existing in the void before Ra brought forth light from the waters of none. It was entropy given consciousness, the universe's death drive made manifest in physical form. The serpent's scales were forged from crystallized darkness, not simply the absence of light, but negative illumination that actively consumed photons and converted them into pure nothingness. Each scale was larger than a pharaoh's shield and harder than any substance that existed in normal reality, immune to conventional weapons and resistant even to attacks powered by divine will. Its eyes burned with anti-light, a radiance that consumed illumination rather than creating it, leaving behind voids in reality where its gaze fell. These weren't simply dark spots but actual holes in existence where the fundamental forces that maintained the coherence of space-time had been temporarily suspended. Staring directly into those eyes would cause the observer to begin unmaking themselves, their own existence gradually dissolving into the same void that served as Apophis's natural element. When Apophis opened its mouth, the sound that emerged wasn't a hiss in any recognizable sense, but rather the screaming of every soul that had ever been devoured by despair, combined with the dying echoes of entire universes that had collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. This cacophony could drive gods to madness, strip away memories of joy and hope, and implant certainty that existence was nothing more than a cosmic accident destined for termination. Every night, as Ra's barque sailed through the Doat toward this final confrontation, Apophis would rise from depths that extended not just through physical space but through dimensions of pure negation, where the concept of existence was treated as a temporary aberration to be corrected through systematic destruction. The serpent didn't simply attack like a normal predator seeking food. Its assault was preceded by waves of supernatural terror that made even Set grip his spear with trembling hands, followed by reality distortions that caused crew members to momentarily forget their own names, their purposes, and their reasons for believing that continued existence was preferable to dissolution into primal void. Everything you know about the sun god was only the beginning. Apophis's approach was like watching a living mountain emerge from an ocean of liquid despair, its movement causing tidal waves of concentrated hopelessness that crashed over the barque and tested every protective spell the crew had prepared. The creature's mouth could swallow entire fleets of ships without the slightest difficulty, its venom could poison rivers for thousands of years, and its very presence dimmed Ra's light, until the god barely glowed like dying embers in a fireplace that had run out of fuel. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the knowledge that Apophis wasn't entirely evil in the conventional sense that mortals understood the concept. The serpent was the universe's immune system, designed during the earliest moments of creation to prevent reality from expanding beyond sustainable limits and consuming resources that were meant to remain in reserve for future cosmic cycles. From Apophis's perspective, creation was a kind of cosmic cancer, spreading light and consciousness into realms that were meant to remain empty and silent, disrupting the perfect balance of the void with unnecessary complexity and unwanted activity. The serpent's attacks on Ra weren't motivated by malice or hatred, but by a primordial imperative to maintain the balance between existence and nothingness that had been established before the first gods were born. The serpent remembered the time before creation, when silence reigned supreme, and the concepts of hope, love, and joy had never been imagined because there were no minds to conceive them. In that era of perfect simplicity, there had been no suffering because there was nothing to suffer, no conflict because there was nothing to conflict with, no death because there had never been life. If Apophis succeeded in devouring the sun god permanently, the consequences would extend far beyond simply preventing future sunrises. Reality itself would collapse back into the void of none, but this wouldn't be a return to the peaceful emptiness that had existed before creation began. Instead, it would be a corrupted void, contaminated by the memories of existence that had been forcibly terminated. Every person who had ever lived, every pharaoh who had ruled, every monument built, every prayer whispered, every act of love or courage or sacrifice, all would be erased as if they had never existed, but their absence would leave scars in the fabric of nothingness itself. The pyramids would crumble to dust that would itself cease to exist, but the space where they had stood would forever carry an echo of vanished grandeur. The Nile would dry up, and its very memory would be wiped from the cosmos, but the riverbeds would remain as channels carved through nothingness, permanent reminders of the life that had once flourished along their banks. Even the gods themselves would fade like half-remembered dreams, but their absence would create hollow spaces in the void where divine power had once resided. The battle between Ra and Apophis played out in the depths of the Doat with a ferocity that shook the foundations of the afterlife, sending tremors through dimensions that mortals couldn't perceive, but that affected their dreams, turning peaceful sleep into nightmares of being devoured by impossible darkness that had weight and texture and malevolent intelligence. Ra, weakened from his journey through the underworld and diminished by the daily cycle of death and rebirth that had been grinding away at his essential nature for millennia, would face the serpent using tactics that varied depending on which hour of night the confrontation occurred, and how much divine strength he had managed to preserve during his passage through the previous 11 hours of horror. Sometimes Ra fought as a great cat, his divine form transforming into that of a massive feline whose claws gleamed like golden daggers and whose eyes burned with the concentrated fury of noonday sun. In this form he would leap upon Apophis's neck with the fluid grace of a natural predator, clawing at the serpent's scales while avoiding the creature's snapping jaws and the lashing tail that could shatter mountains with its impact. The transformation into feline form wasn't arbitrary symbolism, but a calculated tactical choice. Cats possessed reflexes and agility that made them uniquely suited for fighting opponents many times their size, combined with an instinctive understanding of how to target vital points for maximum damage. This is why cats were sacred throughout Egypt, seen not merely as useful predators that controlled vermin, but as earthly representatives of Ra's battle against the forces of cosmic chaos. You won't believe what Ra feared most. Other times, Ra appeared as a man with a ram's head, wielding spears of pure sunlight that could pierce even Apophis's crystallized darkness, scales, and cause wounds that burned like miniature suns embedded in the serpent's flesh. In this form, Ra's voice would boom through the underworld with such power that it could be heard in dimensions where sound had never existed before, chanting spells of binding and destruction that had been taught to him by Thoth during the early days of creation, when the fundamental forces of magic were still being discovered and codified. Each word of these ancient spells carried the weight of divine authority accumulated over thousands of years of successful spellcasting, but also the desperate edge of a god who knew that defeat would mean not just his own destruction, but the end of everything he had spent eternity creating and protecting. The spells were written in languages that predated human speech, using concepts that could only be expressed through divine consciousness and sound combinations that would shatter mortal minds if overheard. During some battles, particularly when Apophis had managed to inflict serious damage early in the fight, Ra would transform into a phoenix, his body becoming living flame that could fly above the serpent's reaching coils while raining down fire that burned with the concentrated heat of 1,000 desert noons. The phoenix form allowed him to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, but it also made him more vulnerable to certain types of counterattacks. If Apophis managed to catch the phoenix Ra in its jaws, the serpent's anti-light nature would extinguish Ra's flame instantly, leaving him helpless and dying in the creature's mouth. This had actually happened several times throughout history, resulting in solar eclipses that terrified mortal populations, who could see their sun being literally devoured by cosmic serpents but had no way to influence the outcome of the battle. The most desperate battles saw Ra calling upon his eye, the Uraeus serpent that lived in his crown, which would expand to enormous size and battle Apophis directly in combat that was serpent against serpent, chaos against order, entropy against creation. These duels could last for hours of subjective time, though the distortions of space-time in the deepest parts of the duet meant that the entire battle might occur in the space between one heartbeat and the next, as measured by mortal observers. When the eye fought independently, it became a creature of pure divine will, its scales forged from crystallized determination, and its venom composed of concentrated justice. The wounds it inflicted on Apophis would burn with righteous fire, but the damage it received in return would be transmitted directly to Ra himself, creating a feedback loop of shared agony that tested the sun god's endurance to its absolute limits. Set, the god of chaos and storms, ironically became Ra's greatest ally in these battles, though his motivations weren't entirely altruistic. Despite his reputation for violence and his infamous murder of his brother Osiris, a crime that had stained his divine essence with permanent marks that could never be fully cleansed, Set understood that if Apophis succeeded in destroying Ra, there would be no chaos left to rule, only the absolute void that had existed before creation began. Set's chaos was creative disorder, the force that prevented reality from becoming too rigid and predictable, the source of innovation and change that kept the universe growing and evolving. Without controlled chaos, creation would become stagnant,
locked in perfect but lifeless patterns that would eventually calcify into cosmic death as surely as Apophis's entropy, but far more slowly and boringly. Apophis represented destructive entropy, the end of all possibility rather than the introduction of new possibilities. If the serpent won, there would be no universe for Set to cause trouble in, no mortals to confuse with unexpected events, no cosmic order to subvert through creative mischief. From Set's perspective, helping Ra wasn't heroism but intelligent self-preservation. The next revelation will change everything you thought you knew. Set would stand at the prow of Ra's barque with a massive spear forged from crystallized lightning captured during the most violent storms that had ever raged across the earth. The weapon was so charged with electrical energy that it glowed with its own internal light, crackling with power that made the air around it taste of copper and ozone. His attacks were guided not by noble heroism or selfless courage, but by practical necessity combined with the kind of violent enthusiasm that came naturally to a god whose essential nature was conflict and disruption. He needed Ra to survive so that there would continue to be a universe for him to cause trouble in, but that didn't mean he couldn't enjoy the fighting that survival required. Set's technique in battle was unlike anything used by other gods. Where divine warriors typically fought with disciplined precision and strategic thinking, Set embraced controlled madness, allowing his chaotic nature to guide his movements in ways that made him unpredictable even to enemies who had been fighting him for millennia. This unpredictability served as a perfect counter to Apophis's ancient intelligence and systematic approach to destruction. During particularly fierce battles, when Apophis's assault threatened to overwhelm even Ra's divine defenses, other gods would abandon their normal duties to join the fight. Neith, the ancient goddess of war and weaving whose skills with both weapons and thread had been developed over geological ages, would fire arrows of light that could blind Apophis temporarily while burning channels through the serpent's scales deep enough to expose vulnerable flesh beneath. Sobek would emerge from the underworld rivers that flowed through dimensions parallel to the main battle site, his massive crocodilian jaws capable of crushing substances harder than diamonds and his hunting instincts refined by millions of years of predatory evolution. His attacks would focus on Apophis's tail and lower coils, attempting to limit the serpent's mobility while other gods attacked more vital targets.
Even gentle Hathor, the cow goddess normally associated with love, music, and motherhood, would transform into her fierce aspect as Sekhmet during the most desperate moments, adding her lioness fury to the collective assault. In this form, she became a creature of pure divine rage, her claws capable of rending not just flesh but the very concepts that held Apophis's existence together. But despite all their combined efforts, some nights the battle would go poorly from the very beginning. Ray's light would dim to almost nothing as Apophis's anti-radiance drained his divine energy faster than he could replenish it. For terrifying minutes that seemed to stretch into hours, the sun god would disappear entirely into the serpent's gullet, swallowed alive and beginning the process of digestion that would end reality forever if allowed to continue to completion. These were the nights when eclipses occurred in the world above, when mortals looked up at the sky and witnessed their sun being literally devoured by cosmic serpents whose shadows could be seen moving across the solar disk. The sight would send entire populations into panic, as people realized that the battle between light and darkness was real and immediate, not metaphorical or safely abstract. But here's the secret the ancient priests never told. The priests and astronomers who understood the cosmic significance of eclipses would mobilize every resource at their disposal during these events, performing emergency rituals designed to provide Ray with additional strength while he fought for his life inside Apophis's digestive system. These ceremonies required split-second timing and absolute precision. A single mispronounced syllable could interfere with Ray's escape attempts and doom him to permanent imprisonment within the serpent's body. The ancient Egyptians didn't simply wait passively for Ray's nightly battle to conclude, hoping that their god would somehow manage to survive another confrontation with forces that grew stronger and more cunning with each passing night. They understood that the outcome of the battle in the duat could be influenced by actions taken in the world of the living, and they developed increasingly sophisticated rituals designed to tip the cosmic balance in their sun god's favor. The most powerful of these was the overthrowing of Apophis, a ceremony performed at dawn in temples across Egypt by priests who had spent decades learning the precise words, gestures, timing, and mental states required for the magic to be effective. These weren't simply symbolic rituals performed to make the participants feel useful, but complex magical operations that required deep understanding of cosmic forces and flawless execution under enormous pressure. The priests would create detailed wax figures of Apophis, each one crafted with anatomical precision that required extensive knowledge of the serpent's true form as it existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception. The figures had to be sculpted during specific hours of the night, using wax that had been blessed with waters from the primordial flood, and charged with energy from lightning strikes that had occurred during the most violent storms. They would then burn these figures while reciting incantations in the sacred language that predated even hieroglyphic writing, using words that existed at the intersection of sound and meaning in ways that modern linguistics couldn't explain. Each syllable had to be pronounced with exact precision. Too soft, and the spell would lack power; too loud, and it might attract unwanted attention from entities that were better left undisturbed. The timing of these ceremonies was absolutely crucial. They had to be performed at the exact moment when Re's barque was engaged in battle with Apophis in the 12th hour of night, which required priests to maintain accurate calculations of the sun god's journey through dimensions where time moved at different rates and sometimes flowed backward or sideways through alternative causal sequences. A ceremony performed too early would waste its power on empty space where the battle had not yet begun. A ceremony performed too late would arrive after the outcome had already been determined, potentially interfering with Re's escape from the underworld and causing him to become lost in dimensional corridors from which even divine power might not be sufficient to navigate back to normal reality. But most dangerous of all was a ceremony performed at exactly the wrong moment, when the magical energy intended to help Re would instead strike Apophis and provide the serpent with additional power to complete its destructive mission. This had actually happened several times throughout Egyptian history, resulting in extended periods of darkness, failed harvests, and social upheaval that required generations to repair. The most powerful version of this ritual required the participation of trained temple cats, who would attack the wax serpent while the priests chanted, their claws and fangs blessed to serve as weapons of light that could strike at Apophis across dimensional barriers. These cats weren't merely symbolic participants but were believed to be temporarily possessed by fragments of Re's divine essence, transforming them into living extensions of the sun god's will. And then came the moment that would curse Re forever. The selection and training of these temple cats was a process that took years and required careful observation of feline behavior under various mystical conditions. Not every cat was suitable for this sacred duty. The chosen animals had to demonstrate unusual courage, intelligence, and spiritual sensitivity that allowed them to perceive and interact with forces beyond normal feline experience. The Egyptians also developed protective amulets and talismans designed to channel human prayers directly to Re during his battles, creating a network of spiritual support that spanned the entire kingdom and operated continuously throughout every night. These weren't simple good luck charms that people wore for psychological comfort, but sophisticated magical devices created by priest-sorcerers who understood the fundamental principles governing the interaction between divine and mortal consciousness. The most effective amulets contained drops of genuine solar gold, metal that had been exposed to Re's direct gaze during the moment of noon, when his power reached its daily peak and his divine essence was most concentrated. This gold was different from ordinary gold in ways that went beyond simple chemical composition, containing traces of crystallized sunlight that maintained their connection to Re regardless of physical distance or dimensional barriers.
But the priests understood something that terrified them into absolute secrecy, something that was never carved into temple walls or written in any papyrus scroll that common people might find and read. This knowledge was passed down through oral tradition among the highest-ranking religious officials, shared only during secret ceremonies held in underground chambers, protected by wards that would kill anyone who attempted to enter without authorization. Re was growing weaker with each passing century. Each nightly battle with Apophis left scars on the sun god's divine essence that never fully healed, accumulating like tiny cracks in a dam that would eventually spread and cause catastrophic failure. The accumulated damage of thousands upon thousands of years of dying and being reborn was slowly eroding Re's fundamental nature, transforming him from the pure creative force he had once been into something more complex, more troubled, and more vulnerable. As millennia passed and the cosmic battles took their cumulative toll, Re began to age in ways that no god should age, his divine form showing signs of wear and deterioration that shocked even the other immortals who had thought divine nature was by definition permanent and unchangeable. His bones, once composed of pure solar fire that burned with the intensity of stellar cores, became silver, still precious and powerful, but lacking the blazing intensity of his youth. His flesh, which had gleamed like polished gold and radiated warmth that could be felt from vast distances, took on the duller hue of metal that had been worked too often and was beginning to show signs of fatigue. Most disturbing of all, his hair became lapis lazuli, beautiful in its deep blue color and precious in its rarity, but brittle and prone to breaking when he moved his head too quickly, or when the stresses of battle caused his divine form to shift unexpectedly. More troubling still, Re began to drool. This wasn't simply an embarrassing sign of divine senility, but had consequences that rippled through multiple levels of reality. From Re's divine saliva, which fell to earth during his daily journey across the sky, new and chaotic creatures were born, beings that were unlike anything that had existed during the early days of creation, when the fundamental patterns of life had been established according to principles of order and harmony. These new creatures included monsters with too many eyes arranged in patterns that violated the normal rules of symmetry, spirits that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and could never be completely destroyed because part of their essence always remained beyond the reach of any attack, and entities that fed on abstract concepts rather than physical matter, consuming courage, hope, and love with the same voracity that normal predators showed toward flesh and blood. The final truth will haunt your dreams tonight. Even the gods themselves were disturbed by these spontaneous creations. Thoth, whose wisdom encompassed all knowledge that had ever been accumulated by any thinking being, found himself unable to classify or understand these new entities. His attempts to study them resulted in observations that contradicted each other and drove him to fits of frustrated confusion that were completely unlike his normally serene demeanor. Ptah, who had helped establish the original forms of life, and whose creative powers were legendary throughout the pantheon, discovered that his abilities had no effect on these chaotic beings. He could not improve them, repair them, or modify them in any way, as if they existed according to principles that operated independently of the cosmic laws he had helped write during the early days of creation. Most terrifying of all, even Maid found that these creatures somehow existed outside the cosmic order she was responsible for maintaining. Her feather of truth, which could detect the smallest deviation from justice and harmony, could not get stable readings from these beings. They seemed to flicker between states of lawful existence and complete chaos, making it impossible to determine whether they were beneficial, harmful, or simply incomprehensible. This aging wasn't natural decline in any sense that mortals might understand the concept. Gods weren't supposed to grow old and weak through the simple passage of time. Instead, this was the cumulative effect of dying and being reborn every single day for thousands upon thousands of years, with each cycle leaving microscopic scars on Re's divine essence. These wounds were so small that they were invisible to other gods and completely beyond mortal perception. but they accumulated over time like tiny stress fractures in a structure that was being asked to bear more weight than it had been designed to support. Each battle with Apophis left Ray slightly less than he had been the previous day, though the changes were so gradual that they were only noticeable when compared across centuries rather than individual battles. Each passage through the duat drained a little more of Ray's primordial power, the fundamental creative force that had allowed him to bring forth existence from the void of none. The underworld itself had been designed to weaken him, to ensure that he arrived at his confrontation with Apophis in a vulnerable state that would make the battle challenging rather than a foregone conclusion. This weakness was necessary for maintaining cosmic balance. If Ray remained at full strength during his battles with the Chaos Serpent, he might eventually destroy Apophis permanently, which would upset the delicate equilibrium between order and chaos that kept reality stable. Without the constant threat of dissolution, creation might become complacent and stagnant, eventually dying not from external attack, but from internal stagnation. But the system had never been designed to continue for eternity without maintenance or adjustment. Ray was paying a price that the original architects of cosmic order hadn't fully calculated, trading pieces of his essential divinity for each sunrise, slowly transforming from a god of pure creative force into something less defined, less certain, and less capable of protecting the world he had created. The consequences of Ray's weakening rippled through all of creation, like cracks spreading through a crystal that had been struck by a hammer. The effects were subtle at first, noticeable only to the most sensitive observers, but they gradually became apparent to anyone who paid attention to the patterns that governed Egyptian civilization. The pharaohs who claimed to be Ray's earthly representatives and derived their authority from their connection to the sun god, found their own power waning in ways that were difficult to define but impossible to ignore. The divine magic that had once allowed them to command the flooding of the Nile with perfect timing, to ensure successful harvests through royal decree, and to protect Egypt from foreign invaders through the sheer force of their connection to cosmic power, became less reliable and more likely to fail at crucial moments.
The seasons became less predictable, no longer following the precise patterns that had allowed Egyptian civilization to flourish for millennia. The Nile's floods, once perfectly synchronized with Rena's celestial journey, and as reliable as sunrise itself, began to vary in their intensity and timing in ways that disrupted agricultural planning and threatened the food security that formed the foundation of Egyptian society. Some years brought floods that were too weak, delivering insufficient water and silt to fertilize the fields properly. These lean years resulted in failed harvests, food shortages, and social unrest as people struggled to understand why the gods had abandoned them. Other years brought floods that were too strong, washing away entire villages, destroying stored grain supplies, and leaving fertile farmland poisoned with salt and debris that would take years to clear. The unpredictability of the floods forced Egyptian society to develop new strategies for survival, including more extensive grain storage systems, alternative agricultural techniques, and diplomatic relationships with neighboring civilizations that could provide food during lean years. But these adaptations came at enormous social and economic cost, and they never fully compensated for the loss of the divine reliability that had once made Egypt the most prosperous and stable civilization in the known world. In his weakened and increasingly unstable state, Ray began to experience psychological changes that were even more troubling than his physical deterioration. His once benevolent nature slowly curdled into suspicion and resentment as the constant pain of his nightly ordeals combined with the growing difficulty of his daily duties to create a burden that would have been crushing for any consciousness, mortal or divine. The God who had once loved humanity with the uncomplicated affection of a parent for beloved children, began to see mortals as ungrateful offspring who had forgotten their creator, who took the daily miracle of sunrise for granted, and who worshipped younger, stronger gods while neglecting the deity who had given them life itself and continued to sacrifice himself daily for their continued existence. Re's divine senses, which had once been used primarily to monitor the health and happiness of his creation, increasingly turned toward surveillance and paranoia. He began using his cosmic awareness to eavesdrop on the thoughts and conversations of mortals, looking for signs of disloyalty, ingratitude, or rebellion that would justify his growing resentment toward the creatures he had created. When Rhea, monitoring human activity with the obsessive attention of a jealous lover, overheard mortals planning what he interpreted as rebellion against divine authority, his rage burned hotter than his noon sun and lasted longer than the longest drought. The conversations that triggered his fury weren't particularly sophisticated plots or dangerous conspiracies, but simply the normal complaints that people make when life becomes difficult and they begin to question the systems that govern their existence. The mortals were complaining about the hardships of their daily lives, questioning why the gods demanded constant worship and expensive offerings while allowing suffering, disease, and death to exist, and wondering aloud whether human civilization might be better off governing itself without divine interference. To people struggling with failed harvests, foreign invasions, and social upheaval, these seemed like reasonable questions that deserved honest discussion. To Rhea, exhausted by millennia of cosmic battle and hypersensitive to any perceived slight against his authority, these conversations represented the ultimate betrayal. He had sacrificed pieces of his own divine essence every single day for thousands of years to ensure that the sun would continue to rise, that crops would grow, that the cosmic order would be maintained against forces that sought to reduce everything to primordial void. In return for this daily sacrifice, humanity dared to question his authority, to suggest that they didn't need divine protection, to imply that they could manage their own affairs without the constant intervention of gods who had dedicated their entire existence to serving mortals who seemed incapable of appreciating the magnitude of the gift they had been given. Re's response was swift, terrible, and completely disproportionate to the actual threat posed by human discontent. He unleashed his eye, a devastating aspect of his divine power that manifested as the lioness goddess Sekhmet. But this wasn't the gentle healing aspect of his solar radiance that brought warmth and growth to the earth. Instead, this was Re's fury given independent physical form, a goddess whose very existence was dedicated to the systematic destruction of human civilization. This wasn't merely sending an angry deity to punish a few rebels or teach a lesson about respect for divine authority. This was Re attempting to commit genocide against the entire human race, wiping out his own creation in a fit of rage that demonstrated just how badly his long ordeal had damaged his mental stability and moral judgment. Sekhmet, drunk on divine wrath, and empowered by Re's accumulated resentment that had been building for centuries, descended upon Egypt like a plague given physical form and malevolent intelligence. She slaughtered humans by the thousands, moving through cities and villages with the efficiency of a natural disaster combined with the deliberate cruelty that only conscious malice could provide. The goddess didn't simply kill, she reveled in the act of destruction, wading through blood that rose first to her ankles, then to her knees, then to her waist as the bodies accumulated around her. She developed increasingly creative and terrible methods of murder, turning death into an art form where each victim's demise was crafted to maximize both physical agony and psychological terror for any survivors who might witness the carnage. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and bones in minutes. Cities that had been centers of learning, culture, and commerce became ghost towns where the only sounds were the echoes of screams that seemed to linger in the air long after their sources had been silenced forever. The Nile itself began to run red, not just with blood but with the dissolved essence of human dreams, hopes, and memories. Every aspiration that had been cut short, every love story that had been ended prematurely, every artistic vision that would never be completed, all of these intangible losses became visible as a crimson stain that flowed through the heart of Egyptian civilization. The very air became poisonous with the concentrated terror of the dying, creating clouds of psychic pollution that rained down on survivors like acid, burning not just their skin but their capacity for hope, trust, and joy.
The psychological damage from breathing this contaminated atmosphere would persist for generations, creating a legacy of trauma that would affect Egyptian culture in ways that would never be fully understood or healed. Only a desperate trick devised by the other gods, who realized that Sekhmet's rampage threatened not just humanity, but the entire cosmic order that depended on the relationship between mortals and immortals, saved the human race from complete extinction. Thoth, Puth, Toth, Hathor, and the other deities understood that if Sekhmet completed her mission of human annihilation, there would be no mortals left to worship them, no civilization to maintain the temples, and no priests to perform the rituals that helped Re in his nightly battles against Apophis. Working together with the desperate efficiency that comes only from facing extinction, they produced thousands of jugs of beer and dyed it red with ochre and pomegranate juice to make it look exactly like human blood. The deception had to be perfect. Sekhmet's divine senses could detect even the smallest discrepancy between real blood and artificial substitutes, so the gods added subtle magical enhancements that replicated not just the appearance but the spiritual essence of spilled life force. Then they spread this false blood across the land in the path of Sekhmet's rampage, creating vast pools and rivers of what appeared to be the spillover from her successful massacres. The goddess, encountering what she believed to be an enormous reservoir of human blood, couldn't resist drinking it, thinking it was evidence of her own devastating effectiveness and a reward she had earned through her diligent work of destruction. The alcohol in the beer affected even a goddess whose divine constitution should have made her immune to mortal intoxicants. But the beer had been specially prepared with fermentation techniques that incorporated divine brewing methods, creating an alcoholic content that could intoxicate even immortal beings. Sekhmet became so thoroughly drunk that she forgot her murderous mission entirely, her rage dissolving into confused euphoria as the alcohol disrupted the divine fury that had been driving her to genocide. In her intoxicated state, she transformed back into Hathor, the gentle cow goddess of love, music, and motherhood, her capacity for destruction temporarily neutralized by fermented grain and the clever deception of her fellow deities. The transformation was accompanied by healing energy that began to repair some of the damage she had inflicted, though nothing could bring back the thousands who had already died in her rampage. But the psychological damage had been done, and it would persist for generations. Thousands upon thousands of humans had died in the most horrible ways imaginable, and Re's relationship with humanity had been permanently severed by his demonstration of divine wrath unleashed without restraint or mercy. No longer could mortals look upon their sun god with the pure trust and gratitude that had characterized their relationship for millennia. They had seen what divine rage looked like when unleashed without the moderating influence of wisdom or compassion, and they knew with absolute certainty that their continued existence depended not on Re's love for them, but on his mood and mental stability. The genocide attempt revealed something crucial about Re's deteriorating psychological state that the wisest observers among both gods and mortals found deeply disturbing. The sun god's growing instability made him vulnerable in ways that a healthy deity would never experience, and Isis, the goddess of magic and wisdom, whose understanding of divine psychology was unmatched, recognized an opportunity that might never come again. She understood that Re's paranoia, exhaustion, and accumulated resentment had made him careless in ways that his younger, stronger self would never have permitted. His divine essence, once carefully guarded and perfectly controlled, now leaked into the world through various unconscious actions and involuntary responses to stress. Isis devised a plan to steal something that had been considered impossible to obtain throughout the entire history of divine existence: Re's secret name, the word of power that contained the fundamental essence of his divine authority and made him who he was at the most basic level of reality. Every god possessed both a common name, which could be spoken aloud in prayers and rituals without dangerous consequences, and a secret name, which was their true identity made manifest in pure linguistic form. This secret name was far more than just a word or combination of sounds. It was the concentrated essence of the deity's power, the fundamental vibration that had brought them into existence during the earliest days of creation. The secret name contained not just the god's identity, but their entire history, their deepest fears and greatest strengths, their most carefully guarded vulnerabilities, and the specific combination of cosmic forces that maintained their divine existence. Whoever knew a god's secret name could command that deity absolutely, strip them of their powers, force them to reveal any information, or even unmake them entirely by speaking the name backward while performing the appropriate ritual of unraveling. For this reason, secret names were guarded more carefully than any treasure, hidden so deeply within divine consciousness that even the gods themselves sometimes forgot them during periods of extreme stress or injury. Most deities took elaborate precautions to ensure that no trace of their secret name could ever escape their control, creating multiple layers of mental barriers and spiritual encryption that made theft impossible under normal circumstances. But Isis understood that Ray's condition was far from normal. His deteriorating mental state had made him careless about maintaining the psychological defenses that protected his most sensitive information. More importantly, his divine saliva, which had once been carefully contained within his body, now fell to earth regularly during his daily journey across the sky, as his control over basic bodily functions declined. This divine drool wasn't just unpleasant evidence of Ray's aging, it contained traces of his essential divine nature, microscopic fragments of the same substance that his secret name was made from. With sufficient skill, knowledge and patience, these fragments could be collected and used as the foundation for magical workings that would normally be impossible.
Working with the patience that only immortal beings could sustain, Isis spent decades collecting Radha's divine saliva wherever it had fallen to earth, using magical techniques to preserve its potency and prevent it from dissipating back into the cosmic background energy that permeated all existence. She mixed this divine essence with sacred earth from the banks of the Nile, creating a substance that partook of both divine and mortal nature. From this mixture, using magical techniques that had been taught to her by Thoth during the earliest days of her education in the mystical arts, Isis crafted a serpent that was far more than an ordinary snake. This creature was specifically designed to be Radha's perfect nemesis, incorporating his own divine essence in ways that would make it uniquely dangerous to him personally. The serpent's venom was created from Radha's own divine saliva, meaning that his usual immunity to poisons would be completely useless against it. Its fangs were crafted to penetrate even divine flesh that had been hardened by millennia of cosmic battles. Most crucially, its bite would create a wound that could only be healed by magic that required knowledge of Radha's secret name to activate properly. With infinite care and meticulous attention to timing, Isis placed this serpent in the exact spot where Radha walked each day during his routine inspection of the temple at Heliopolis. She chose a location where shadows fell in a particular pattern that would make the snake difficult to see until it was too late, where the morning sun would create just enough glare to interfere with even divine vision, and where the ground cover would muffle any sound the serpent might make while positioning itself for the attack. Then she waited, counting the days with the patience of stone until Radha's predictable routine brought him to that exact location at precisely the right moment. The sun god, preoccupied with his growing list of cosmic responsibilities and distracted by the constant pain from his nightly battles, walked directly into the trap without noticing the danger until the serpent's fangs had already penetrated his divine flesh. When the serpent bit the sun god, its venom burned through him like liquid fire mixed with crushed diamonds and concentrated agony. The pain was unlike anything Radha had ever experienced, even during his most devastating battles with Apophis in the depths of the underworld. This wasn't external injury inflicted by a separate enemy. This was his own divine essence turned against him, his fundamental nature poisoning itself from within in ways that violated every principle of cosmic order. The venom didn't just cause physical pain but attacked Radha's divine consciousness directly, creating confusion, doubt, and fear that were completely foreign to his usual mental state. For the first time in his existence, Rad experienced genuine terror, not of external threats but of his own helplessness in the face of forces he couldn't control or understand. Rad had agony that was both physical and spiritual, his cries of pain shaking the foundations of Heliopolis and causing earthquakes that rippled across Egypt with force that toppled buildings and opened cracks in the earth that would never fully heal. The sound of a god in genuine distress was so alien and terrible that mortals who heard it were driven temporarily insane, unable to process the reality that their divine protector could suffer like any mortal creature. The other gods rushed to help him with the desperate urgency that comes from witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. They brought every form of healing magic at their disposal, tried every remedy that had ever been discovered, and called upon cosmic forces that had never before been used for medical purposes. But their efforts proved completely useless against a poison crafted from Radha's own divine substance. Thoth's wisdom could diagnose the problem with perfect accuracy but could offer no solution. Pasa's creative power could fashion new remedies of unprecedented sophistication, but none would take effect against venom that was part of Radha's own essential nature. Even Hathor's nurturing energy, which could heal almost any wound and soothe almost any pain, simply passed through Radha's body without providing the slightest relief. Only Isis possessed the magical knowledge necessary to cure the poison she had created. But when Radha begged her for help with the desperate humility of a dying creature, she made a demand that stunned even the other gods with its audacity. She would heal him only if he revealed his secret name to her. Radha initially refused, understanding the full implications of such a revelation even through the haze of agony that clouded his divine consciousness. Giving Isis his secret name wouldn't just grant her access to his powers, it would make her the most magically powerful being in the Egyptian pantheon while simultaneously stripping him of the protections that had kept him safe for millions of years. But as the venom continued to burn through his divine form like acid eating through metal, spreading from the bite wound to contaminate his entire spiritual essence, Radha's resistance began to crumble. His vision blurred as divine senses that had never failed him began to shut down. His strength ebbed away like water poured onto desert sand, leaving him weaker than he had ever been in his entire existence. Desperate and genuinely dying for the first time since his emergence from the primordial waters, with cosmic responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned weighing on his failing consciousness, Radha finally whispered the secret name that contained the essence of his divine power. The words themselves were so potent that speaking them aloud caused reality to shimmer and warp around the syllables. The air filled with golden light that was brighter than the sun itself, while miniature suns danced around Isis's head like a crown of living fire. Ripples of power spread through dimensions that mortals couldn't perceive, announcing to entities throughout the cosmos that a fundamental change in the balance of magical authority had just occurred. At that moment, Isis became the most magically powerful being in the Egyptian pantheon, while Radha lost not just the protection his secret name had provided, but also the spiritual armor that had shielded his deepest fears and most carefully guarded vulnerabilities from external examination. The secret name didn't just grant Isis access to Radha's abilities, it gave her complete insight into his fundamental nature, revealing his psychological weaknesses, his growing despair about his cosmic role, his secret terror that he might eventually fail in his battle against Apophis, and his deepest shame about the genocide he had attempted when his mental stability finally cracked under the weight of eternal responsibility. After losing his secret name, Radha's nightly deaths transformed from cyclical renewals into genuinely perilous events where permanent destruction loomed as an increasingly probable outcome. Each battle with Apophis brought him closer to a final defeat that would leave the world in eternal darkness, not because of cosmic necessity or natural cycles, but because he simply lacked the strength to continue fighting a war that had been grinding him down for millennia. The other gods began to whisper among themselves with increasing urgency about contingency plans that had once been unthinkable. What would happen if Radis didn't return one morning? The question that had once been pure theoretical speculation became a topic of desperate planning sessions conducted in the deepest chambers of divine palaces, where even the walls had magical sensors that reported conversations to intelligence networks spanning multiple dimensions. Thoth created backup scrolls containing spells for finding and empowering a replacement sun god, though he privately doubted that any other deity possessed sufficient power to take Ra's place without extensive preparation that might take centuries to complete. His research into alternative solar deities revealed that most possibilities had serious drawbacks that would make them unsuitable for the cosmic role that Rad had filled so successfully for so long. Set, despite his chaotic nature and general disdain for long-term planning, began organizing defense strategies for protecting the world if Apophis succeeded in permanently devouring Ra. His plans involved mobilizing every god, spirit, and magical artifact in existence for a final battle against entropy itself, though he understood that their chances of success without Ra's power would be minimal at best. Even Patha, whose creative abilities were legendary throughout the pantheon and whose optimism was usually unshakable, started crafting artifacts designed to preserve light itself in crystalline form. These devices were intended to provide at least temporary illumination if the sun failed to rise, buying time for desperate attempts to restore cosmic order before reality collapsed entirely. The priests across Egypt, sensing their gods' growing vulnerability through subtle changes in the quality of sunlight and increasingly irregular timing of dawn, created backup plans with the methodical precision of architects designing structures to survive earthquakes, floods, and invasions simultaneously. They identified other solar deities from neighboring civilizations whose worship might be imported and adapted to Egyptian needs if necessary. They developed hybrid theological systems that could incorporate foreign gods into Egyptian cosmology without completely disrupting existing religious structures. They even began secret negotiations with distant kingdoms, exploring the possibility of sharing divine resources in exchange for mutual protection against cosmic threats. They developed new magical rituals designed to strengthen Radas more effectively than traditional ceremonies, incorporating techniques learned from captured foreign sorcerers and combining them with ancient Egyptian wisdom to create hybrid spells of unprecedented potency and complexity. These new rituals required enormous sacrifices that went far beyond the traditional offerings of food, incense, and precious metals. The most powerful of these ceremonies demanded the life force of volunteer priests who were willing to give years of their own existence to empower their failing god. These volunteers underwent elaborate preparation rituals that purified their souls and concentrated their spiritual energy into forms that could be easily transferred to divine consciousness. The process was irreversible and often fatal, but the priests who participated considered it the highest honor possible. Most desperately of all, they began secretly worshipping younger deities like Amun-Ra, hoping that merging Radas with fresh divine energy from other sources might revitalize their sun god through a kind of theological transfusion. These merged deities represented attempts to patch Ra's declining power with borrowed strength, like using wooden planks to shore up the crumbling walls of a building that had been damaged beyond normal repair. But perhaps most tellingly, the priests began to build monuments designed to last forever. The pyramids, the Sphinx, massive temple complexes constructed with blocks so heavy that moving them required divine intervention or engineering techniques that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. These weren't just tombs for dead pharaohs or places of worship for living gods. They were insurance policies carved in stone, designed to preserve Egyptian civilization and religious knowledge, even if Ra's light failed permanently and the kingdom was plunged into eternal darkness that would destroy all organic life and reduce human culture to scattered memories preserved only in the most durable materials available.
The architectural precision of these monuments encoded astronomical knowledge that would allow future generations to track the movements of celestial bodies, even without divine guidance from Ra's daily journey across the sky. The hieroglyphs carved into their walls contained complete mythological narratives, mathematical principles, and magical formulae that represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom preserved against the possibility that oral traditions might be lost if the priests themselves perished in the chaos that would follow Ra's final defeat. Every pyramid was oriented to catch the first rays of dawn with mathematical precision, designed to concentrate and amplify whatever solar energy might remain if Raz survived his battles in increasingly weakened form. The internal chambers contained mirrors and crystals arranged in complex patterns that could focus light into healing beams designed to help restore their god's strength, turning each monument into both a tomb for mortal pharaohs and a medical facility for divine patients. As Raz's struggles intensified with each passing night, the psychological burden of his cosmic role began affecting him in ways that even immortal consciousness wasn't designed to handle. Every morning, as he prepared for another day of providing light and warmth to millions of living beings who depended on his power for their continued existence, he carried the terrible knowledge that his failure would mean not just his own destruction, but the end of every life that required solar energy to survive. This weight of responsibility would have been crushing even for a god at full strength, operating under optimal conditions. For Ra, weakened by millennia of battle, stripped of the protections his secret name had provided, and tormented by the knowledge that his divine essence was slowly deteriorating beyond any possibility of repair, it became a form of cosmic torture that infected every moment of his existence with dread and despair. He couldn't enjoy a sunset without thinking about whether he would be strong enough to rise again the following morning. He couldn't rest during his journey across the sky without worrying that Apophis was growing stronger while he conserved energy for the battles ahead. He couldn't take pleasure in the warmth he provided, or the life his light enabled without being reminded that all of it depended on his ability to continue fighting a war he was slowly losing.
Every plant that withered from drought, every harvest that failed due to unusual weather patterns, every child that died of cold during an unusually harsh winter, Ra blamed himself for these tragedies, seeing them as evidence of his declining ability to fulfill the divine duties he had accepted when he first brought light to the world. The God who had once created life through joyful acts of divine will now struggled to maintain existence through grim determination and stubborn refusal to surrender to forces that seemed destined to eventually overwhelm him. Joy, wonder, and creative enthusiasm gradually drained out of his daily routine, replaced by mechanical duty and desperate hope that he could somehow find the strength to continue for one more day. His relationships with other gods became strained as his anxiety and depression deepened into psychological conditions that affected his ability to function normally in social situations. He would snap at Thoth for minor navigation errors that had never bothered him before, criticize Set's battle techniques despite owing his continued survival to the Chaos God's protection, and withdraw from conversations with other deities who tried to offer comfort, advice, or simple companionship. The social bonds that had once sustained him through difficult periods became sources of additional stress as he worried about disappointing those who looked up to him, feared that his weakness would contaminate other gods through proximity, and became convinced that his failures were bringing shame to the entire pantheon. Most tragically of all, Ra began to lose his connection to the joy and wonder that had originally motivated him to create the world in the first place. The universe that had once seemed like a magnificent experiment in beauty and complexity, a playground for consciousness to explore infinite possibilities, now felt like a burden he carried solely from duty and fear of what would happen if he abandoned his responsibilities. Sunrises that had once filled him with pride and satisfaction now reminded him only of battles barely won and strength that would never be fully replenished. The laughter of children, once as beautiful to him as any music, now sounded like accusations from future victims of his inevitable failure. The growth of plants, the flow of rivers, the movement of wind, all the natural phenomena that had once demonstrated the success of his creative work now felt like reproaches from a world that depended on him but didn't understand the cost of the protection he provided. Despite his personal struggles and the mounting evidence of his declining capabilities, Ra remained absolutely bound by Ma'at, the principle of cosmic balance and divine justice that governed all existence, including the behavior of gods themselves. This wasn't simply a philosophical concept that could be abandoned when it became inconvenient, but a fundamental force woven into the structure of reality itself, as inescapable as gravity, entropy, or the speed of light. Ma'at demanded that Ra continue his daily journey regardless of his personal fears, desires, or assessment of his chances for long-term success. The cosmic order required the sun to rise each morning according to schedules that had been established at the beginning of time, the seasons to follow their ancient patterns with the reliability that mortal civilizations depended on for agricultural planning, and the balance between light and darkness to be maintained through his ongoing struggle with forces of primordial chaos. Even if Ra wanted to abandon his responsibilities, and during his darkest moments when the pain of his cosmic battles combined with psychological despair to create suffering beyond mortal comprehension, he desperately did want to simply stop fighting and allow whatever would happen to happen. The universal laws he had helped establish during the early days of creation prevented him from making that choice. This created a paradox that tormented the sun god more than any physical injury inflicted by Apophis or any psychological wound caused by his deteriorating relationship with humanity. The very system of cosmic justice and divine order that he had created to ensure fairness, stability, and protection for all conscious beings now trapped him in a cycle of suffering that grew worse with each passing day. He was simultaneously the architect of cosmic law and its most prominent victim, the creator of a perfect system of universal justice that had become so rigid and comprehensive that it couldn't make exceptions even for its own creator when circumstances changed in ways that hadn't been anticipated during the original design process. The goddess Ma'at herself, who was both Ra's daughter and the living embodiment of the principle that bore her name, watched her father's decline with growing concern that was mixed with absolute helplessness. She understood better than anyone how much he was suffering, could see more clearly than any other observer how close he was to the breaking point that would end his ability to continue his cosmic duties. But she was powerless to intervene in ways that would actually solve the problem without disrupting the cosmic balance that her existence was meant to preserve. To save Ra might require breaking the fundamental laws of justice and order, which would cause reality itself to collapse into chaos more complete than anything Apophis could achieve through direct assault. Ma'at faced a moral dilemma that had no good solutions. She could maintain cosmic law and watch her father slowly destroy himself through the fulfillment of duties that were grinding him to nothing, or she could break cosmic law to save him and thereby doom everyone and everything else to the dissolution that would follow the collapse of universal order. This divine catch-22 revealed the tragic limitation of even godly power and wisdom. Having created a perfect system of universal justice that operated without favoritism, exceptions, or mercy, Ra had discovered that perfection itself could become a form of tyranny more complete than any imposed by conscious malice. The system he had designed to protect everyone equally now bound even its creators to rules that admitted no exceptions, showed no mercy for special circumstances, and demanded sacrifices that grew heavier with each passing eon. The cosmic order that had once seemed like the greatest possible achievement now felt like a prison from which escape was not only impossible but would be morally wrong even if it were achievable. As news of Ra's struggles filtered down through the ranks of priests and eventually reached the common people through whispered conversations and subtle changes in religious ceremonies,
Egyptian religious practices began to evolve in direct response to their god's evident vulnerability. What had once been expressions of gratitude for reliable divine protection gradually transformed into desperate attempts to help a failing deity survive each day's challenges. Morning prayers, which had traditionally been offerings of praise and thanksgiving for the gift of dawn, were restructured as magical rituals designed to channel human life force directly to Ra during his battles in the underworld dimensions, where mortal help had never before been needed or expected. These weren't simple changes in wording or emphasis, but fundamental alterations in the purpose and methodology of worship that required priests to develop entirely new theological frameworks. Entire communities would gather before sunrise in temple courtyards and village squares, joining their voices in chants that required precise timing, pronunciation, and emotional state to be magically effective. The words had to be spoken with perfect synchronization. The breathing had to follow patterns that matched the rhythm of Ra's cosmic heartbeat, and the mental focus had to be maintained without wavering despite the physical and psychological demands of the ritual. These community ceremonies were physically exhausting for participants and spiritually draining in ways that left people weakened for days afterward, but they were also deeply meaningful expressions of human solidarity with divine struggle. Every village became a support network for their cosmic protector, every citizen a soldier in the war against entropy and despair. The creation of solar amulets evolved from a minor craft practiced by a few specialists into a major industry that employed thousands of artisans working with materials, techniques, and magical principles that had never been needed when Ra's power was reliable. These weren't simple decorative items or psychological comfort objects, but sophisticated magical devices that required months of work to create and years of careful charging with accumulated prayers and positive intentions. The most effective amulets incorporated fragments of genuine solar gold that had been exposed to Ra's direct gaze during moments of peak power, combined with crystals that had been grown in temple chambers using water blessed by multiple generations of high priests. The metalwork required techniques that pushed human craftsmanship to its absolute limits, while the magical enchantments demanded knowledge that was closely guarded by guild organizations whose members swore binding oaths of secrecy. Temples dedicated to Ra began operating around the clock rather than following traditional schedules, with shifts of priests maintaining continuous rituals designed to provide their god with whatever support human magic could offer during his most desperate hours. These ceremonies were so demanding that participants could only maintain them for short periods before being replaced by fresh volunteers. The physical demands included hours of complex gestures that required dancer-like flexibility and athlete-like endurance, while the mental requirements involved maintaining perfect concentration on abstract concepts that existed only in divine consciousness. The spiritual costs were even higher, as priests had to open their own souls to cosmic forces that were never meant to interact directly with mortal consciousness. The worship of solar aspects became increasingly specific and technical rather than general and emotional, with different prayers for different hours of Ra's journey, specialized rituals for each season that took into account the varying length of days and nights, and elaborate ceremonies timed to coincide with Ra's most dangerous encounters in the underworld. What had once been a religion of celebration, joy, and gratitude became a religion of cosmic emergency response, where every prayer was a rescue mission, and every ceremony was a battle against forces that threatened the continued existence of reality itself. The transformation reflected the larger changes occurring throughout Egyptian society as people adapted to living in a world where divine protection could no longer be taken for granted. The story of Ra's decline and his daily battle for survival against forces that grew stronger while he grew weaker reveals something profound about the ancient Egyptian understanding of existence that modern minds, accustomed to thinking of gods as omnipotent beings beyond the reach of normal limitations, often struggle to comprehend. Unlike many mythologies where gods exist in states of perfect power and endless victory, untouched by doubt, pain, or the possibility of failure, the Egyptians recognized that even divine authority requires constant renewal, constant struggle against entropy and chaos, and constant vigilance against the forces that seek to return all things to the primordial void from which they emerged. This wasn't a pessimistic worldview born from ignorance or primitive thinking, but a mature and sophisticated understanding of the fundamental nature of existence itself. Nothing worthwhile persists without effort and sacrifice. Light must be earned rather than assumed. Life itself is a temporary victory in an ongoing war against dissolution that requires the active participation of every conscious being to maintain. The Egyptians understood that Ra's daily struggles were both literal cosmic events and perfect metaphors for the human condition, expanded to divine scales. Just as the sun god faced battles that tested his strength, courage, and determination to their limits, mortal humans faced daily challenges that required them to choose repeatedly between hope and despair, construction and destruction, love and fear, meaning and nihilism. This perspective gave Egyptian civilization a unique form of resilience that allowed it to survive and flourish for thousands of years despite invasions, famines, political upheavals, natural disasters, and social changes that destroyed other cultures. When faced with overwhelming challenges, Egyptians could remind themselves that even their most powerful god struggled with forces beyond his complete control. That survival required not divine intervention, but personal commitment to the ongoing work of existence. Every golden dawn was earned through cosmic battle, magical support, and the collective will of mortals who refused to let their god face oblivion alone. Every successful harvest was a victory celebrated by humans who understood that abundance required their active participation in the maintenance of cosmic order. Every act of creativity, justice, compassion, or courage was a contribution to the universal effort to prevent reality from sliding back into the meaningless void from which it had originally emerged. Today, thousands of years after the last priest performed the overthrowing of Apophis in temple chambers that have long since crumbled to dust, the sun continues to rise each morning with the reliability that allows modern civilization to exist. Though contemporary humans rarely pause to consider the ancient battles that once raged in cosmic dimensions beyond ordinary perception, the psychological and spiritual truths encoded in these stories remain as relevant as ever. We still face daily battles against forces that seek to extinguish hope, love, creativity, and meaning from our lives and our world. We still struggle against the entropy that would reduce all human achievement to forgotten dust, all relationships to isolation and suspicion, all dreams to cynical disappointment. The names and specific forms have changed, but the cosmic war between order and chaos, between meaning and nihilism, between life and death, continues with the same intensity in every human heart, every human community, and every human civilization. The ancient Egyptians understood that consciousness itself was a form of light, not metaphorically or symbolically, but literally and fundamentally, and that maintaining awareness, compassion, and purpose required the same kind of daily commitment and sacrifice that Ra demonstrated in his eternal struggle against forces that would reduce everything to primordial darkness. They knew that every act of creation, whether artistic, intellectual, or emotional, was a contribution to the cosmic effort to prevent reality from collapsing back into meaningless void. Every choice to love rather than hate, to build rather than destroy, to hope rather than despair, was a victory in the same war that Ra fought against Apophis in the depths of the underworld. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep and surrender consciousness to the realm of dreams where normal rules are suspended and deeper truths become visible, remember that somewhere in dimensions beyond ordinary perception, the battle between light and chaos continues with the same intensity and significance that it has maintained for billions of years. The sun that will rise tomorrow morning isn't guaranteed by the laws of physics alone, though they certainly play their role. According to the ancient wisdom preserved in Egyptian mythology, sunrise is also the prize won by forces that choose hope over despair, creation over destruction, love over fear, meaning over emptiness, and the ongoing work of consciousness over the seductive simplicity of non-existence. Rest well, knowing that some struggles transcend individual existence and require not just personal strength, but collective commitment to values and principles that outlast any single lifetime. The God who faced the serpent of chaos in the depths of cosmic darkness understood something that modern humans often forget in their rush toward convenience, efficiency, and immediate gratification. The most important battles are fought, not for quick victories or immediate rewards, but for the privilege of facing the same essential challenge again tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as long as consciousness persists in its eternal war against the forces that would reduce everything to silence, emptiness, and forgotten dreams. Remember Ra, who bled light into darkness, who died each night so that life could continue each day, who faced cosmic horror with divine courage while teaching mortals that even gods must earn their victories through sacrifice, struggle, and absolute refusal to surrender to despair. May his eternal example illuminate your dreams and strengthen your resolve to face whatever battles await you when you wake, to greet another dawn that represents both gift and responsibility, both blessing and challenge, both ending and beginning in the endless cycle of death and rebirth that connects all conscious beings to the fundamental rhythms of existence itself.